G'day, this is Professor Joseph Drew, and I'm here to explain to you why some local government jurisdictions use unimproved land tax as the basis for calculating their taxation, or as we say in Australia, their rates. Please note that not every jurisdiction uses unimproved land tax. Please also note that I'm not 100% in favour of unimproved land tax. However, I do know that lots of people are confused about what it is and what it means and why we have it, and that's certainly been the case from some official publications from government departments of late, so I'm here to set the matter straight. Thank you. We'll go on to the next slide. So it all starts with Henry George. He was a natural law philosopher. Now, some of you may or may not know that I write a lot on natural law philosophy. I've got a dozen publications in top-ranked journals and write about natural law philosophy in my books as well. So natural law philosophy is a type of philosophy that goes back to the time of Aristotle. Some people say Plato. I prefer to go back just as far as Aristotle. That talks about how we can make good moral and practical decisions by using practical reasoning, using our minds to think through a problem, observing human nature, observing real nature, thinking about the ultimate ends of things, the teleological ends of things, and being prepared to say that if we come up with a good idea, it should be universalized. It should apply to all people in all places if it truly is a good idea. So that's probably the briefest account you'll ever hear of natural law philosophy, and I don't want to give you a philosophy lesson. In later videos I will do videos on natural law philosophy, the principle of double effect, the principle of subsidiarity, practical reasoning, practical syllogisms, etc. But that will be in a separate playlist. But I do have to talk about natural law philosophy because Henry George was a natural law philosopher. And they've got some key ideas in natural law philosophy. One is that people deserve to have possession and keep control of the fruits of their labour. If you make something, you produce something, or you earn something, a natural law philosopher says that you're entitled to keep it. Now, you have some obligations to your community. You have some obligations in terms of charity if you go to Aquinas's work. But on the whole, natural law philosophers believe in people keeping what they create with their own hands. Now, Henry George came out to Australia in 1890. It was a much celebrated series of seminars, and he got a mixed reaction. His idea at the time was to have a single tax. Now, I know Pauline Hanson came up with a single tax, and she got blasted by the media for coming up with it, but there is an argument for this single tax, and the idea is a single unimproved land tax. If we reduce government expenditure down to what governments ought to be involved in, the legitimate remit of government, and there'll be a video on that one too, then a single land tax would quite possibly be sufficient. Now, the idea is to capture the increase in value of land that hasn't been earned by the person. So he came out to Australia, had a particular interest in Australia, was married to Matilda, who was an Australian, and it stimulated a lot of conversation, and I imagine that's why in New South Wales, for instance, Australia's largest state, we have an unimproved land tax. So let's talk a little bit more about the key principles. So if you buy a block of land, or the farm where I live on, and I have a house on it, there's two reasons why my farm will go up in value. One is because I've done lots of work. I built a house, I put in many kilometres of fencing, I've put in a bore pump so I have access to semi-reliable water, I've improved my pastures, etc. I've planted gardens, orchards. The other reason my farm will go up in value though is because of things that other people have done. So as population grows, either organically or due to immigration, there's more demand for housing, house prices go up. If a new industry is built or there's a boom in a particular industry, houses and farms nearby may well go up. If Moombi suddenly becomes the financial centre for Australia, we give up Sydney and put the financial apparatus and central bank and everything in Moombi because it's a much more pleasant place, let me tell you, well, then my the price of my land will go up considerably. If we were to get a bitumen road, or the federal government was to do some useful work on their highway, unlike what they're doing at present, and extend it and make it a lot faster, if they were to put a rail station in, a high-speed rail station that we've been promised for decades and decades, if any of those things happened, my land value would go up too. Now, all those things are due to the efforts of other people, particularly the community as a whole. Now, what the idea of Henry George is to capture the value created by others, not the value created by me. So that's why he proposes an unimproved land tax. So if we only have the unimproved land value, we take out things like the fencing, the pasture improvements, the orchard plantings, the bore, the house, the sheds, animal sheds, and everything else. So they're all the things I did, but they all come off if we're just looking at unimproved land value. And if we measure the increase in unimproved land value and tax that, what are we doing? We are asking me to give back to others the unearned wealth that I got by virtue of other people's efforts. So a unimproved land tax is really a tax on unrealized capital gains. You will recall that your home property is not subject to capital gains tax. So it's a way of capturing the value that other people have created, returning to the community some of the money that the community uses to develop infrastructure and develop the society to such an extent that the price of my value of land will go up. So it's actually a really, really fair tax. Unlike income tax, where I get taxed for my work, an unimproved land tax is only taxing me on the part of the money that I received that I did nothing to earn. You can't get much fairer than that. I wish all taxes were incident like that. In my future book I'm writing at the moment, Freedom and Local Government, I'll spend a lot more time talking about taxes and how we could extend this idea of an unrealised capital gains tax to other areas to generate sufficient revenue to run government. I do talk about it in my book, Saving Local Government. It was written particularly for councillors and council staff and the community. I do talk about it a little bit, but I'll be going in a lot more detail in the book that I'm presently writing. So the key principles of natural law taxation, again, are people ought to keep the fruits of their own labour. 2, taxation should be incident on the superfluum. What does that mean? The proprium is the money I need to keep my household at the standard of living that they're used to. Anything beyond the proprium is actually my superfluum. This is money I've got left over, superfluous, extra money. And under natural law philosophy, that money is reasonable to tax me on it, but it's also reasonable to expect me to use that money by way of charity, and welfare is just a form of charity, for instance. So taxation is a way of forcing people to be charitable who may not otherwise be charitable with their superfluum. And certainly that was the position of Thomas Aquinas, the great natural law philosopher of the Middle Ages, as related by John Finnis, who's the #1 natural law philosopher in the world at the moment. Number 3, taxation is a responsibility of being a member of a community. I have a moral responsibility to everyone else in this community to help provide the things that people need. Please note I'm saying need, not want. So often local government remit goes beyond need and gets into wants, and when that happens, taxation becomes theft. But if this is money, taxation is going towards things people need, I have a moral obligation to provide that for my fellow citizens as part of being a community. Number 4, taxation is not a fee for service. It's got absolutely nothing to do with what I receive in return from local government. And this is the most common misconception out there. And you think about other taxes. You think about your income tax, for instance. I pay an awful lot of income tax, 50, 60 grand a year, whatever it might be. Now, do I demand to get lots of federal government services in return for my income tax? No, I don't. I accept that I'm part of the community of Australia, and I have a moral obligation to my fellow Australians to contribute towards their needs being provided. I don't say, look, I paid 50 grand's worth of income tax. I want a federal court system in Moombi, and I want a federal Department of Health in Moombi, and I want a hospital, and I want my own police station. There's only 500 people in Moombi. I don't do any of those things. That'd be completely unreasonable and silly. That would be turning a tax into a fee for service. Yet when it comes to local government, people do that. It's quite bizarre. They say, I'm paying lots of tax because I'm on a rural property, therefore I want a bitumen road, and I want septic, and I want water, and if I don't get those things I should pay less tax. No, that's wrong. First of all, you're confusing a tax with a fee for service. Second of all, you're mistaking the whole purpose of a tax on unimproved land. What you're being asked to do when you pay your rates, you're paying your land taxes in Australia, is you're being asked to return back some of that money that you did absolutely nothing to earn. It's a matter of justice that you pay the same rate of tax as everyone else, irrespective of what service you get, because otherwise you would be keeping more of unearned wealth than other people, and that would be plainly unfair. Now, I will do a video down the track because I believe every local government in Australia needs to take a good hard look at their taxes and at the taxes they charge for various categories of land. And that's something I'll be talking about in a later video. And the last thing is there should be distributive justice. What that means is that the burden and the benefits from local government should be shared as equally as practical. Remember, we've got to use that practical reason. We've got to think through these things, what makes sense. It doesn't make sense for Tamworth Council to stick a wide 4-lane bitumen road with curb and guttering and street lights and everything else out the front of my farm. There's very few cars travel on this road. I'm sure my cattle, donkeys and goats would love to have street lighting so that they can sit out in the paddock at night and see each other and whatnot, and see what grass they're eating, but it's unnecessary and it would be unrealistic to do it. So whilst there is a burden for distributive justice, we should be talking more about distributive justice in terms of where the taxation burden falls, not necessarily where the benefits fall, because sometimes some benefits would be unreasonable. So there are problems with unimproved land tax. One of the problems, the big thing that was levelled at Henry George, was that it wouldn't bring in enough revenue. And Henry George said what I'd probably say. A lot of the problems we have at every level of government is not necessarily about the revenue, it's about the expenditure. Let's have a good look at that expenditure side of the equation and get that down to needs and get efficiency in the expenditure before we worry about whether we're going to get sufficient revenue or not. Now, unimproved land tax is not actually levied properly anywhere in Australia. It's actually levied on the whole value of the land, which is wrong. It should be levied on the increase in the value in the land. And if that was done and it was made clear to people, I think people would understand it better. There was also a criticism, this is back in 1890, these criticisms, the old criticisms, about capacity to pay. Well, you can make that criticism with any non-income tax. GST, when I go to the grocery store, do I have the capacity to pay the 10%? The fuel surcharge, and in rural Australia we get to pay the fuel surcharge plus GST on a higher price of fuel, which means we actually spend more on our fuel tax than others. There's a capacity pay issue there too. You can talk about capacity to pay on just about everything other than income tax, and even then, depending what the proprium is for the household, there could be a capacity to pay argument. So it's a little bit of a moot argument given that it applies to every tax, but people are being on and on and on about capacity to pay when they're talking about their land rates. High density development, now that is a serious problem. And of course in 1890 we didn't have skyscrapers and people living in units and things like that. It was suggested, and it was Henry George, people said to Henry George, look, you'll end up with unsuitably small blocks of land because people are trying to minimise their tax. So they were sort of thinking that way, but they could never have guessed where we would end up living vertically. That is a problem, and in my book forthcoming book, Saving Local Government, I actually deal with that problem, describe how we can deal with that problem. Valuation frequency and accuracy is done in a deplorable manner in every state in Australia. We really need to take a better look at how we're doing these valuations, the accuracy of them. It is a problem if there's not lots of unimproved land being sold to base that valuation on, but we can do a lot better on what we are, and we can do it a lot more frequently than what we are, which means we would capture it a lot better and there'd be a lot less rate shock in between valuations. And poor community understanding, well, that's why I'm here doing this video. Hopefully you understand now why we have the unimproved land tax and all the really good points. And the thing for me is, it's a fundamentally fair thing. You're asking me to give back some money that I never earned. If you think about it in those terms, you'll feel a lot better next time you see your rates notice from your local government. Thank you very much. Goodbye.